On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, a number of financial measures capped off the 13th National People's Congress. What can we expect this year?
刀刃向锐，壮士断腕的改革。
And mass shootings strike 2 Christchurch mosques. Why has terrorism come to New Zealand?
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live from Monday to Friday on CGTN. We begin our program today in Beijing, where the second session of the 13th National People's Congress concluded its 10-day meeting on Friday morning. Chinese Premier Li Keqiang met the press soon after the NPC session concluded. Before we ask our panelists about the implications of the policies this time, take a look at this.
It's official. China's annual political meetings, the 2 sessions, have wrapped up. At the closing session, deputies approved the government work report, a new foreign investment law, an economic and social development plan, and the annual budget, among others. The foreign investment law was approved after days of deliberation. It has attracted global attention since it gives foreign investors unprecedented access to the Chinese market. This is a milestone in the nation's opening up journey. The work report also stresses the pursuit of higher quality development. The economic growth target has decreased from 6.5% to 6%, while the tax cut for private enterprises is worth 2 trillion yuan. When Premier Li Keqiang took questions from the media, China's economy and its foreign relations dominated the marathon Q&A session. He said despite a slowdown, the country was determined not to use large-scale quantitative easing to prop it up. Instead, the government would look to revitalize the market through high-quality development and measures aimed at boosting consumption.
Tax and fee cuts means government's income will fall, but the growth of fiscal spending will be in line with the GDP growth this year, especially to ensure spending on key areas such as people's livelihood.
The Premier touched upon the importance of creating more jobs, as this would drive social prosperity. On China-U.S. relations, Li said he was quite optimistic that both sides could resolve their current impasse.
For more on the outcome of the 2 sessions and Premier Li Keqiang's news conference, in Chicago we have Yang Da-Li, professor of Department of Political Science at the University of Chicago. Welcome, sir. In Houston, we have Dan Slane, ex-commissioner for the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review. What a pleasure to see you once again. And joining us in Beijing, Liu Baocheng, Dean at the Center of International Business Ethics from the University of International Business and Economics. Welcome to the three of you. I want to start with you, Professor Liu, in Beijing. Challenges and opportunities. The challenges seems to be having a bigger weight this time. How much solutions are we really seeing as a result of 2 sessions this time?
Well, as Premier Li put it, the biggest challenge is to stall the development. So therefore, to face such challenges, one is to further open Chinese door for global participation. And the other is to continue to deepen Chinese reform, particularly that is really catered to the deregulation, to reduce the burden on companies, and also to liberalize the market so that we are able to improve the investment climate and to sustain Chinese economic growth.
Right. To you, Professor Yang, you are observing this from the U.S., from the political science perspective. How do you see, in a way, going back to the principles? Premier Li, this time at the press conference, talked about several things. For example, the opening up policy is the fundamental state policy of China. For example, the role of a government is not to give orders to the market, but rather have the market in mind when drawing policies. A lot of the interesting takeaways is this time. Professor Yang?
Well, I think he did a great job in really showing, giving greater confidence to the markets in a way that's reflected also in the securities markets overnight. not only was he emphasizing the importance of stabilizing growth by cutting taxes, reducing burdens, and streamlining government, but he also actually sent a very powerful signal when he said that if the economy does stall, the government actually does have the tools to do more because there is some leeway, whether it's in terms of the reserve ratios or in terms of the deficit. So in that sense, actually, he was really managing truly to sort of in terms of trying to address issues from both the hard side and also from the soft side in terms of economic management.
Mr. Slane, from your perspective, I mean, before the two sessions, you heard quite some negative coverage about China's economy if you look at the so-called headlines in some of the media coverage. However, if you look at the numbers, though, it's not bad at all, to be frank, actually. And also, if you talk about the reserve ratio, as well as the deficit only 0.3% is much, much, much below the 3%, which is the dangerous barometer there. So, Mr. Slane, you know, from a real economic perspective and trade, how do you see the challenges and opportunities China is facing right now?
Yeah, one of the things that the White House is asking for is for the Chinese to open up their markets to American goods. And the Premier is saying that. So I think that's a real positive sign. The other thing that they have to do is increase consumerism. And he's doing that as well. And he's got to get away from an export-dominated economy. So I think he's certainly going down the right road.
Well, it's not just what the White House has asked, isn't it, Professor Yang? It is also what China, with its own momentum, has to reform and also has to do its own things well. You heard that phrase repeatedly this time at the annual two sessions, Professor Yang.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of it is really related to the structural changes within the economy, whether it's demographics. In fact, the Premier spent quite a bit of time talking about services, especially for seniors, but also services for children, in the sense really the fact that there are just not enough facilities to take care of the elderly whose numbers are growing rapidly. So in that sense, as the population ages, also the economy tends to draw down the savings and so on, and become less actually export-oriented.
Professor Liu, about that, it's not just how businesses will be treated, whether it's Chinese businesses, reduction of fees and taxes, 2 trillion yuan this time, and the government organization, also state-owned enterprises likely to provide that part of the money, according to the Chinese Premier. But also, how is China going to motivate its internal market in a way? Welfare issue, as Professor Yang beautifully illustrated, is a big part of it. And this time, the Premier is talking about providing help, support to all the market incentives, even within the community itself, for the elderly and also for the early child education.
Well, we have been implementing the supply-side reform for the last several years, and a certain impact has already been felt in a positive way.
Right.
But in the meantime, supply-side reform will have to look at the consumption side. So with the demographic changes and with the entire supply chain is moving to the higher end of the stream. So therefore, to build equilibrium between supply and consumption is very critical for policymakers, and that can also give much of the positive climate for business to function and for consumers really benefit from this type of reform.
It's about confidence, isn't it? China is not lack of money. It's not lack of liquidity. I mean, it's just a matter of fact, but rather how investors going to be looking at the market, both domestic and international, and also whether consumers are really going to consume, and to what extent they're going to consume, isn't it, Professor?
Yeah, I think a key word is predictability. So if investors are able to predict
in the right direction.
That's right, are able to predict that they are going to earn a reasonable return on the investment on a longer period of time, they will not really go there to gamble. And on the consumption side, I do not think you really need to stimulate them. But rather, if they really have steady income, have a newer job opportunities,
right,
they are able to decide what to buy and how to allocate resources for a longer period of time.
That's right.
So therefore, confidence, as you said, is really based on predictable environment. The government is there to provide that.
And the realities on the ground, of course.
Of course.
Mr. Slane, of course you're observing this from afar, but you know, job, 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 that's a key word everywhere in the two sessions this time as well. The Chinese government is talking about creating 13 million jobs 1 year alone. Of course, Washington talk about jobs too, but not of the same scale. So this is an interesting question. I mean, on the one hand, you have the restructuring of economy already slows down. It's just a natural process. But on the other hand, you also got the external pressure coming from the United States and others about the trade and the future. So how is China going to create those 13 million jobs while the others are asking, well, you should create more jobs for us?
I think the opportunity for China is in the service industry. That's where they're going to create the 13 million jobs. You know, for example, the whole area of taking care of older people in China is in a revolution. I mean, now homes are being built, and there's an enormous healthcare industry that's going to take up a lot of jobs. So the whole focus, I think, in terms of creating those, is going to be in the service sector.
All right. Of course, that will be one of the solutions, but how to translate that theory into realities, there is a very complicated process probably one have to bear in mind. Another thing, Professor Yang, is about U.S.-China relations, and how is that having an impact on China's overall approach to the rest of the world? You heard about issues China-U.S., China-Europe, and China's neighboring countries, including Japan, and China's overall approach to international investors as well. So, Professor Yang, to you, can you name it? What exactly is the approach that Beijing is thinking about right now, given the information you have collected over the past 2 weeks during the two sessions?
Well, I think this is one of the most controversial areas. It's not just about Beijing or Washington, because Washington also, in the process of negotiating with China, is keeping its allies, including the Europeans, at bay in terms of the terms being discussed and so on. But under WTO rules, of course, there is the issue of non-discrimination. So how this issue is going to be resolved later on if the two sides do decide on a deal and find out, reach the terms for agreement, how those terms are going to apply to other countries, that will be a huge issue that I don't think actually has been worked out yet. At this point, the two sides are so focused on bargaining with each other that they are not paying attention to what's going on actually in Europe or in the rest of Asia to some extent. But the Premier, however, did emphasize the reaching out to, however, to Northeast Asia, to Japan and South Korea in particular. So in that sense, there is something important. I think actually China will continue to approach this multilaterally in the rest of Asia and also through the comprehensive partnership and so on.
Mr. Slane, while the negotiations going on, the Chinese Premier at the annual press conference talked about the impossible and unrealistic to decouple the two economies. Now, we know some of those in Washington are already shouting out that slogan, decouple from China. But, you know, really, is that the reality that people can really look at? And whether politics is going to serve the real interest of the two countries?
No, I don't think it's way too late to decouple. It's just too cemented, and so that's not going to happen. I think that Washington wants the Chinese to open up their markets more, and the Premier is saying that he's going to do that. And I think Washington wants the Chinese to help them with the trade deficit. And so that, I think those two things are probably being discussed at the moment.
Yeah, but Mr. Slane, as you may know, the trade deficit since President Trump coming into power only increased rather than decreased, given the fact that it is doing so-called bilateral negotiations and having taking up issues with all the countries and also slashing tariffs on many of its trading partners, but the deficit is only going up rather than going down. So very interesting situation, isn't it? Can Washington blame the others? Can Beijing really bring down the number for Washington?
Well, they can, they can help. That's the biggest deficit. The country with the biggest impact is China. So they could be helpful, and he's got to deal with Europe as well. So you're right, and he's reformed NAFTA, and he's reformed the Korean trade agreement, all to help the deficit situation. So I think I understand it's gone up, but I think there's a certain point where he can start to reduce it.
Well, at least he believes so. Professor Liu, to you, how do you see that map? I mean, if you look at China's overall situation interacting with the rest of the world, you got negotiations going on over there in North America, and you got China and the EU with the premier talking about strategic and long-term vision, and the leaders going to meet early April. You've also got China-Japan at the establishment of relations, quite an anniversary this year, and the G20, in which the Chinese President, Mr. Xi Jinping, going to go there, and certainly there will be some kinds of multilateral and probably even bilateral occasions. You also got China and Russia, a big power relationship going on there, 100 billion yuan, dollars rather, that has been created for bilateral trade. Earlier it was about trade and not catching up with politics, but now it is. So there seems to be a very diversified things going on all at the same time. To you, Professor Liu, Professor of Economics, how do you see this?
Well, China, as we are growing our size, definitely we're going to have a lot of bumpy road along the global path. As Premier Li put it, the more complicated the global issue, the more confident China will be in walking down its own path. He said as long as we are doing the right homework at home, we are not really afraid of all the challenges. But in the meantime, China will keep an open mind and open policy towards the whole world and fully defend the multilateral trading system. So he identified that it is not really the globalization that bears the blame, but it's really some countries that responded in a wrong way to globalization. That really bears the blame. Right. I think he's really also bringing up a wake-up call to many policymakers around the world as how they can really embrace the globalization in a positive way that can benefit their own people and the world.
Mr. Slay, the WTO reform is coming up on the agenda later this year. You see different parties put forward their own versions of so-called suggestions and their bottom line. How do you see with what's going on recently with China's annual political season in that discussion between China and the U.S., for example?
Well, yeah, I think the election of Trump indicated to a lot of politicians that they have neglected the working class in the center part of the United States who were so affected negatively by globalization. So they're trying to protect that segment of the population, and both parties, both Democrats and Republicans, are trying to focus on the what we call the Rust Belt areas of the United States who have been so negatively impacted by globalization. So that's what's going on here politically.
We'll see how that is played out on
and
the
that's going to impact on...
Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, that's what's going to impact a lot on trade with China.
Sure, it will, and it does already, right? Before we go, final question. During the annual press conference, Professor Liu, the Chinese premier was being asked about Huawei and whether China is asking its companies to spy on the other countries, whether it's businesses or state operations. So Professor Liu, the Chinese premier said out and loud and clear, no, not in the past, not present, not in the future. So how will that be able to change some of the rhetorics or misconceptions as Chinese sees it? that's going on around in some of the coverages and people's minds in different parts of the world?
Well, the promises and pledges are very important, but I think more importantly is that we have to believe that facts speaks louder than words. If they really identify someone is stealing the technology or misusing their technical power, then find it and bring them to the court. If not, better shut up.
Okay, Professor Yang, you have different view or similar?
I have no comment on this issue at this moment.
Well, we see a lot of discussions about what has been done, what has not, and what countries will do. Of course, as all of you said, the gentlemen, before we wrap it up, actions speak louder than words, and we'll see how things would evolve from here. For now, we want to thank the three of you, gentlemen, for joining us for this round of discussion and put forward your insights from your own perspectives. Professor Yang Da Li, Mr. Dan Sling, and Professor Liu Baocheng. Thank you so much for joining us. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. Mass shootings strike 2 Christchurch mosques. Why has terrorism come to New Zealand? Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. This is one of New Zealand's darkest days. Those were the words coming from the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, at a news conference on Friday after a horrific attack killed at least 49 people at 2 mosques in Christchurch. The police said one man in his late 20s had been arrested and charged with murder. The suspect will appear in court on Saturday morning.
New Zealand, a pristine country in the southwestern Pacific Ocean. Homicide is rare. In 2017, the number of murders that took place was less than 50. That changed on Friday. At 1:40 p.m. local time, a gunman entered the Al Noor Mosque in central Christchurch, where around 400 worshippers had gathered for Friday prayers. The shooting had broken the sound of sermon. Then people screamed and escaped. The killer left and drove to a different mosque a few kilometers away and killed more people at Linwood Islamic Center. New Zealand's Prime Minister addressed the nation on live television soon after the shootings took place.
This is one of New Zealand's darkest days. Many of those who will have been directly affected by this shooting may be migrants to New Zealand. They may even be refugees here. They have chosen to make New Zealand their home, and it is their home. They are us. The person who has perpetuated this violence against us is not. They have no place in New Zealand.
Shortly before the shooting, a man had posted a manifesto online and then streamed a 17-minute-long video that shows him shooting worshippers in mosques. The video has been taken down by social media sites. Leaders around the world condemned the attack, and people in New Zealand have expressed their sadness.
Our heart's just breaking for them. It's just so sad, and it shouldn't happen in our country. We need to be embracing of each other. We need to be just reaching out, checking on our neighbours, whether they're foreign or not to us. We need to be reaching out to each other.
The city of Christchurch was struck by a devastating earthquake in 2011. People are still recovering from that disaster, but for them, this might be an even bigger shock.
Chinese President Xi Jinping has sent his condolences to the Governor-General of New Zealand. Chinese President Xi said that he was shocked to learn about the serious shooting incident in Christchurch and the severe casualties. On behalf of the Chinese government and the Chinese people, he expressed his deep sympathy and sincere condolences to the government and the people of New Zealand. His thoughts are with the victims, and he wishes the injured will recover soon. That is the latest we want to get to you from CGTN. And for now, let's go to our panel discussion about the New Zealand terror attack that shocked the world. In Beijing, we have Yan Shuai, analyst at the Anti-Terror Center at the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations. Welcome, sir. Also joining us in Beijing, Rick Dunham, the co-director of the Global Business Journalism Program at Tsinghua University. Welcome as well. Last but not least, we want to introduce to our program from Brussels, Claude Monique, who is the CEO and co-founder of the European Strategic Intelligence and Security Center, who's working on the anti-terrorism issue for quite some time. I want to welcome the three of you on this, what the Prime Minister of New Zealand called the darkest day in the history of New Zealand. Now, I want to go to you first, Mr. Monique. Looking at the info that we have now, what is the nature of this attack, briefly?
It's clearly a terrorist attack. It's a left-wing inspired terrorist attack. It's a hate crime. It was committed by a man who said himself in the manifesto he posted that he's a fascist, he's a racist. It's clearly coming from the extreme far right, if I can say.
Extreme far right. We heard that word quite often, unfortunately, Mr. Dunham, recently. What's going on?
Well, these haters feel like they've been empowered. You have populists who are coming to office around the world. I mean, you can't blame Donald Trump for this, but in the United States, you've had cases of right-wing fascists or neo-fascists, for example, attacking the synagogue in Pittsburgh, and they feel empowered, and the internet has allowed them to share the hate without any censorship.
And the gun issue is also one of those contributing to the problem. Now, New Zealand, Mr. Yan, as you may know, is one of those countries that can be comparable relatively to that of the United States in terms of free access to guns, different kinds of guns. So will that country now, with this incident, have a second thought of what's going on?
Yes, New Zealand is always considered one of the peaceful countries in the world. And so the controls on the guns are quite loose, and according to the government statistics, that there's 1.2 million guns, private guns owned by the private citizens, and there are only 5 million population in New Zealand. So that this is quite a high average, and according to my research, that the New Zealand passed a gun control law maybe more than 30 years ago. So I think this massacre incident will lead to a hot debate on how to tighten the control on the guns.
Right. If you look at that, Mr. Monique, the shooter was shooting people indiscriminately, meaning whoever is there, no matter what that person stands for or not, he's going to shoot that person to death. And we heard about how long this lasted. It was horrific. So, Mr. Monique, the issue is not just about the gun itself. That's the phenomenon related to it. But rather, why do we have far-right extremism like this, and even in a peaceful country like New Zealand?
I think, first of all, we must underline that the main shooter, we don't know if the three other people which were arrested are linked to the crime, but the shooter himself was not a man from New Zealand, he was an Australian.
Right.
So New Zealand is not really directly concerned by this man, except of course for the crime of today. But what we can say is that you have, in every country, you have a kind of reserve of far-right people They are very low percentage of the society, of course. But in the last year, with the questions linked to immigration, to radical Islam and so on, those people found the possibility to increase their influence through internet, through all the hate speech, through the dissemination of exclusion and hate propaganda. So that explains that now they are a little bit more than a few people, but it's a very, very small fraction of the society. We are speaking of maybe some hundreds of people in Australia, some thousand people in Europe. This is not a mass phenomena. This is a phenomena of extremists which are nourished by hate and probably for some of them which have some, let's say, mental problems. It's clear when you read the manifesto that this man was deeply perturbed.
Yeah, but you know, one of the things really provide some food for thought, that is, Mr. Monique, why it didn't happen years ago, but rather happen now, even though the shooter chose New Zealand, a beautiful and peaceful place, as the location for this mass shooting. They want to wake up the attention of all the rest of the world. They certainly want to cause this collateral damage as much as they can to make sure they have a signature onto the world scene. That's the problem, isn't it, Mr. Monique?
Absolutely. If I can say with all the respect I have for the victim, it's a kind of advertising. This man said clearly in the manifesto that what he wants is to launch a civil war, is to increase violence, is to increase attacks against Muslims and foreigners. It's to increase attacks and hate against non-European people. And of course, if you do it in a very quiet place like New Zealand, which is not used to this kind of violence, it never happened. This kind of thing never happened in New Zealand. You will, and he knew that, you will make the front page of all the newspaper of the world. And that's clearly what this man was talking for.
And this is exactly what the world should think about right now, Mr. Dunham, that we cannot play into the hands of the terrorists. They want to have the attention. They want to have their practices publicized all over the world. They want to have what they call as their theory and ideology and their hatred as the headlines of all the media organizations. And unfortunately, there are people who play into their hands and try to spread around the rumors, and also the horrific shooting scenes that we have seen in some of the social media platforms. So, Mr. Dunham, are we going to be smart enough not to do that?
Well, this is a no-win situation because it's huge news around the world. It was chosen that way, a soft target in a peaceful country. We have to report that. What we don't have to do is share the images on social media, and I think it's the responsibility of the platforms like Facebook, YouTube, Twitter to really police it. In this case, the man streamed his murderous rage live on Facebook, and it was only when the police called him that Facebook took it down, but already there were copies that are shared on YouTube and Facebook. There's a responsibility, I think, to police it. We can't be terrorized. That's the goal of terrorists, but we also can't pretend it didn't exist.
Mr. Yan, about that too. You see rumors spread around in social media chat rooms and things like that, whether it's in China or elsewhere in the world. People at the time of panic and fear tend to believe a lot of nonsense. But how the public can be better prepared and prevent themselves from, you know, becoming a toy being played by the terrorists, and prevent them from going into all of these rumors that we have seen over the past few hours, or shall I say 10 hours or so, since the incident happened.
I want to add some thoughts to your previous question. I think although the incident is an isolated attacks in New Zealand, but actually it's increasing phenomenon, especially in the Western world, such as in United States, in UK, in Canada. In the past several years, they all have this kind of attacks against mosque. They all have this kind of attacks. So I think this is a kind of conflicts between the maybe culture or between the different values. And right now, I think some politicians in some countries, they have used this kind of values to increase their popularity in their own country. And so I think in order to prevent this kind of threat to deteriorate, I think first of all the politicians need to do some work, and also the media need to play their role in prevent the kind of images or the videos from spreading to the globe.
When you talk about different incidents, major terrorist attacks, we want to have a list of them right now to share with our audience, have struck all corners of the world. Last year, gunmen in Pittsburgh attacked a synagogue while yelling, "All Jews must die," killing 10 people. 2 years ago, ISIL followers committed suicide bombings in 2 churches in Egypt, leaving 45 dead. Most horrifically, 2015, ISIL led the worst terror attacks in France, killing over 100 civilians in the city. And that list, of course, continues as we have seen the very horrific incident in New Zealand this time. Mr. Monique, I want to ask the same question to you that I earlier put to Mr. Yan. How can we prevent ourselves from being played into the hands of the terrorists?
There are 2 ways to prevent it, but it's not a 100% insurance, of course. The first one is clearly education. It's the work of the schools, of universities, of the parents, the families. It's the work of the media, of course. It's to educate people, to explain that, yes, of course, we are living today in a kind of world village, and this is a big change for a lot of people. And we can understand that some people are weak and are afraid of this, but they don't have to be. And you have to explain this. That's the first point. Education, education, education. And of course, anti-hate working. The second point will be to control. I think I do not say to a kind of censorship. I'm not advocating censorship, but control the social media, because they are, of course, the easier way to spread this hate propaganda. The third thing, of course, is the work of intelligence. But the point is that when you have someone like this man, who is very similar in this act and in his manifesto to Anders Breivik in Oslo a few years ago, who is preparing his action on his own, quite alone, with probably very few accomplices, it's very difficult to monitor him before the action.
Right. We talk about how should we prevent ourselves from playing into the hands of terrorists, but one thing is very important, probably even more important, that is how can we prevent the moving ground for terrorism to grow. We earlier talked about the hatred issue. So many of the political speeches and rhetorics these days that you see around the world are about us versus the rest, about us versus them. Now, this is quite a concept that some of those are trying to establish in the world, that those who are different from us are not as good, and therefore we should take actions against them. So that is the issue here, isn't it, Mr. Denham?
I think world leaders have a moral responsibility to speak out in a positive way. When you look at some of the destructive rhetoric over the past year, after the attacks in Charlottesville in the United States, with the rallies by neo-Nazis, Donald Trump said there were good people on both sides. That's the wrong approach. In Israel, Bibi Netanyahu has said that all citizens are not equal. Israel is for Jewish citizens. In Iran, you have mullahs who say Israel should be wiped off the face of the earth. This is making the situation worse. I think that they have a moral responsibility to bring people together,
right.
not a political responsibility to win the next election.
We only have less than 2 minutes left. I want to divide that to our two other panelists. Mr. Monique, very briefly, we've seen that in our history, recent history, back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, in some of the developed economies. The U.S., for example, is one of those. Are we going to repeat the same mistake, even though we all know the mistake we made?
I think the problem is that policymakers too often don't think on the long-term issues, and they don't think on the deep issues and the very concerns of the society. They think about the re-election. This must change. People in charge must understand that they must address the real problems and that they must educate the people. It's a part of their responsibility.
Yeah. Mr. Yan, before we go, 30 seconds for you as well.
Yeah, I think it will repeat again and again. As I mentioned, that it happened in other countries before, and I think it has its roots in the Western society. So the most important thing, I think, is to increase the mutual understanding, mutual interaction between different groups, different races, so as to know each other and do not have mistrust or with each other.
Well, of course, that's an ideal world, and every country, I guess, has a role to play in that regard. Thank you so much, the three of you, for joining us on this very important issue. A lot of food for thought, but certainly our condolences to those who lost their beloved ones in this horrific incident in New Zealand, and our heart goes to those in New Zealand, the New Zealand people. Thank you so much, Claude Monique, Rick Dunham.
Thank you.
Yan Shuai. Appreciate it. That's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight, CGTN into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. The weekend is up. Have a good one, everyone. Good night.